Welcome to Writers Talk. This week we'll be talking fantasy subgenres. With me today is Oliver Fox. And yeah, today we're going to be diving into the world of fantasy yet again and discussing the various types of subgenres and maybe a few of the different types of fantasy that are well known, popular, and some of them that are misunderstood. So welcome, Oliver. How are you?
I'm doing well. And yourself?
I'm excellent. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
So I've made a list of various fantasy genres, and I would like to go through them and see what you believe they are, what I think they are, and what a few articles online say they are, and see if we agree. So maybe I can start with the most stereotypical ones.
Yeah.
That is high fantasy and low fantasy.
Right.
So I suppose we'll go with my understanding of it first. I would say high fantasy is the type of fantasy that you get when the world, fantasy world, rests in the balance as part of the story. It usually, has something to do with magic. It might have a dark lord. There will be a destined hero who saves the day. That's what I understand high fantasy to be, more or less. And by contrast, low fantasy would be something where much less is at stake. So, for example, it's just about a young boy who discovers some fairies or something and has a little adventure. I mean, the world's not going to end. Maybe he's not even in any particular danger. Do you agree with that?
So this is fascinating because the short and simple answer is not entirely. I agree with a lot of those elements. I recently took, I mentioned this in a few of the podcasts, but I recently took a literature course on sci-fi and fantasy. Of course, we couldn't call it that. We had to say speculative fiction to make it sound fancy. And one of the things that we kept running into, I mean, the first 2 weeks we just spent honestly defining our terms. What is sci-fi? What is fantasy? What differentiates the two? And we got everything from really simplistic differences. A lot of people who were not initiates with the genre would just say fantasy means dragons, sci-fi means laser guns. Right. And sci-fi is the future, fantasy is the past, specifically medieval or Renaissance era. But I guess what I would add, just shades of nuance or definition to yours, for high fantasy, I've always been given to understand that it's specifically a world outside of our own. It's not Earth. It's not even in our universe. It's a wholly, as much as it can be, a wholly made up setting. So an example of high fantasy, as I've been given to understand it, that a lot of people might know would be the Avatar TV series, right? So this is some place that is wholly different. Yes, there are some similarities because you really can't escape that. And it's obviously influenced specifically by East Asian culture. But it's not simply an alternate universe. It is its own world. And yes, they tend to have big, much larger stakes. The part, what you defined is what Brandon Sanderson in his lectures, I've taken his BYU lectures on YouTube. He would call that epic fantasy. So epic fantasy, regardless of whether or not it's taking place in our world, some version of our world, or a wholly different world, it's a place. It's a fantasy where there are global stakes, essentially. So, usually with.
Just to interrupt. So if we were to divide them into high and epic fantasy, which is what I was going to bring that up next, would you say Beowulf is epic fantasy?
Right. Yes. Right.
Would like a Harry Potter then also just be epic fantasy?
So Harry Potter, yeah, I think it might be epic fantasy. Although a lot of people would put that in another genre that we'll probably talk about
Sure.
a little
Yeah.
bit later. Um,
Where would you place the Lord of the Rings though? Because bear in
Lord of
mind,
the Rings,
I mean, I would say it's the stereotypical high fantasy setting,
right?
but it
So
does
Lord of the
does take
Rings,
place on Earth, although maybe a fictionalized version of Earth.
yeah. So it's Lord of the Rings occupies a weird space because it is, as you say, the archetype for high fantasy, right? It is, or maybe even the prototype.
Certainly, I think. Yeah.
Um, so on the one hand, it has all the hallmarks. If you were to just look at it without the author's additions or interpretations, so if you look at it as just the text itself, I would say it's high fantasy, right? Because it is, like you say, it's global stakes. There's the bumpkin who's the hero who has a fellowship and faces a dark lord. It has all those archetypal pieces in play. It is global stakes, and it appears to be a wholly different world. But as you and I have discussed, I believe in another podcast, um, Tolkien imagined this not as a wholly different world, although it does kind of function that way. It's almost like a parallel version of our world, in which
He
England,
would say it's an imagined history of,
yeah,
of the Western world, I imagine.
right.
Yeah.
Um, I think the thing that complicates that is the fact that he has his own mythos for the gods. There's he doesn't keep it within. He creates his own religion, essentially. Yes, inspired
Yes, yeah,
by
sure. No, I agree.
other,
Yeah. I mean,
but like his.
sort of Catholic
Sorry, go.
overtones, but certainly, you have a sort of pantheon of godlike beings as well.
Right. So yeah, I would say that as far as the as on the surface of it, it's definitely high fantasy, and I would argue as long as you ignore his kind of footnotes about it, it still maintains it is functionally high fantasy. But if you let him butt in with his intentions, which we always know to ignore the artist's intentions because they're irrelevant. Um, that's just a little aside.
There will be comments
Then
about that. So,
right. Sorry, I'm coming from a yes, I've studied writing and I'm a big fan of I write myself, but I also studied philosophy with a focus on aesthetics, and one of the first things that they cover is the intentional fallacy.
death of the author, I suppose, is
Yeah.
what you're talking about there. Yes, indeed. So there's another thing. I think people often get high and low fantasy or epic and low fantasy confused with um, high and low magical settings.
Right. Yep.
And a low magical setting, I think you can say the Lord of the Rings sort of counts as a low magical setting. The most
Yeah.
powerful wizard in the world there seems to be able to make his staff glow as his sort of greatest trick in the Lord of the Rings. What else does he do? Nothing wizardly really. He uses like a magic uh, crystal ball, I guess, as well.
Yeah.
But he doesn't. He
I mean,
doesn't. He doesn't do anything like you see in the Harry Potter universe, where magic is ubiquitous. It's,
right.
it's so mundane that the wizards use it to do their dishes and that sort of
Right.
thing. The stereotypical high fantasy setting for me is actually the sort of the reaction world to the Lord of the Rings, which is Faerun, um, by what's his name, Ed Greenwood,
Okay.
who then sold it to Wizards of the Coast, and it's now the standard Dungeons and Dragons setting.
Gotcha.
So it contains everything that is stereotypical about fantasy.
Right.
Floating islands, magical uses from sorcerers, wizards, psionic mind power people, various magical creatures. In fact, so many magical creatures that it's sort of impossible to imagine this world existing
Yeah.
in anything except game mechanics, I suppose.
Right. Yeah.
And
So that's,
yeah,
go ahead.
and the problem with that sort of world is if you want to have a high magic world that is also a high or an epic fantasy, and it sort of follows that the kind of storyline you would have to write for it is so outrageous
Right.
and must almost concern like the death of the universe itself to have the proper stakes that are involved when you
Yeah.
have people who can cast fireballs at will as just part of their daily life.
So one of the ways that I've noticed authors get around that, and I don't know if you would consider this being in the same thing. So you're saying, you're not talking about hard and soft magic here?
What do you mean by that?
So hard magic is magic wherein the rules are very clearly defined. How it functions. What are the things? What are the means necessary to?
Right. So no, not at all. Just
Okay.
just the ubiquity of the magic, I suppose.
Gotcha. So that it is all pervasive.
Right. Yeah. I
In the
mean,
world.
it
Okay.
can have very clear rules about it.
Yeah.
Various good examples of that, but yeah, it's there are schools for magic. There's rules and regulations regarding magic and that sort of thing. Yeah.
So the ways that I've seen writers across media get away with that, what you're talking about, where it is almost a wholly, unique fantasy world where there's, chimera and, beholders and all sorts of crazy beasts and monsters and magic systems and brotherhoods and things of that nature, is to set it in sort of a post-magic society. So those things were once prevalent, but it's almost like they've died out. They've gone extinct. The brotherhoods are no longer. They're being replaced by, technology. The monsters have all been hunted into extinction, and you see that with, for instance, the Witcher series is kind of about that. It's a world where there are, these remaining peoples who have these incredible magic powers, but they're not ubiquitous. In fact, that's kind of the whole thing, is they're so rare, and the main character is one of those rare few. Or even in George R. R. Martin's Westeros, this is even if you go to his books that are set 200 years before the Game of Thrones saga, there are dragons around, but they're hardly ubiquitous, and magic is it's very unlikely that you will see anybody perform magic, but it is there. So does that kind of make sense? It's something where it once was very prevalent, but it's kind of died off in the meantime.
Yeah, there's a few worlds that actually sort of show that transition, which I quite like.
Yeah.
Robin Hobb wrote a series about an encroaching technological sort of industrial age power on a kind of magic using society, and the magic users just couldn't deal with iron, right? So that was the bane of their magic. So initially, they'd fight each other and they'd use their magic to defend themselves, but the industrial people started using iron bullets in the guns instead of lead, and suddenly the tables turn on them.
Interesting.
I thought that was an interesting way of going about it, and it kind of
Yeah,
turned into like a kind of colonial theme, maybe like early America or like British Empire kind of time period. Um,
fascinating. Yeah,
Another way of going about it is just to include all of those monsters and all those races into your society.
yeah,
And you just have elves perfectly integrated into human society. They'd be the politicians, they'd be the
sure.
people in charge of charismatic roles in society. And you assign certain characteristics to these races, and you put them in stereotypical positions that would be occupied by certain classes in society in a normal world. And that
Right.
way, you make people familiar enough with the world so that they sort of accept that. There's a movie called Bright that did that. Uh,
Yeah,
Maybe not the best example of it, but a very well-known one at least.
yeah,
The Magicians is another good example of that, where you have human society being dominated, or having dominated the world, but there still are magical creatures. They're just sort of in hiding, like the Hudson River
mm,
has a river dragon that's
yeah.
there, but doesn't show itself unless you make an offering of treasure. And there's magician schools, but they're not known to, very much like Harry Potter's world, I suppose.
Yeah.
Magic is secret to the majority of people, but it is there, and people can access it, and a lot of people do. I think that works well for that sort of low and high magic.
Yeah. No, I like that. And honestly, I prefer that latter option to um, sort of just creating set types almost to the point of stereotypes with fantasy creatures and races and just slotting them in. There's a lot of interesting scholarship going on, just discussions in general
There's
about
a magical
that.
setting. What's it called? Shadowrun or something like that. It's sort of like a post postmodern technological setting, maybe like a
Yeah.
cyberpunk setting, but it has magic as well. And one of the things that stood out to me is that you have a dragon who's just in charge of a bank, right? That's his hoard. So he just he,
I
he
love,
just he's built this giant bank building, and he sleeps on top of it, keeping
I
guard
love
of his
that.
treasure. I thought that's a wonderful way of showing a
Yeah.
modern fantasy world. But
And I think that's good because it's kind of cheeky. Whereas I guess what I'm thinking about is the sort of thing where it almost, you use different fantasy races as substitutes for, uh, national or ethnic representation in our world. Yeah, as like proxies for people who actually exist, and then it becomes
yeah,
potentially
Terry
problematic.
Pratchett did that in a more sensitive way, I suppose. He had his trolls and his dwarves as substitutes for uh, immigrant groups, I suppose, in
Yeah,
his cities. Uh, Vampires as well.
yeah,
Uh, um, but yeah, it can work and it can be very effective. I think you have to be subtle, and I think you also have to be sensitive when using that sort of thing. Otherwise, it just
yeah.
comes off as offensive.
Right. Well, and if
Yeah.
it's best if it's not a 1-to-1 ratio. I mean, I think that's why the X-Men are such a timeless and ubiquitous fantasy trope. And I'm not just saying the X-Men is in the Marvel X-Men, but that same idea of magical outsiders living in the world, because they can function as a proxy for any sort of marginalized or disenfranchised group.
It's such
There's
a
not a
good
1-to-1
example
ratio.
of a fantasy setting. I know it's and especially when you take it away from the rest of the Marvel universe, it works so well
Yeah,
because it's not a secret society. Everyone knows about these mutants
yeah,
with these magical powers and whatnot. and the world has to react to them in some way,
Right.
which I always like seeing that in a show or a book where you take the normal world and then expose it to this fantasy trope
Element. Yeah.
element, and it helps the reader sort of just imagine, is the author doing this in the way I would have done it, or is he doing something different? Do I agree with what's going on? And you already have an opinion about the real world and how they would react to these sort of things.
Right.
So it's a good shortcut to get to a plot that you have.
Absolutely. Now, it creates a good psychological and emotional distance so that the author can, as long as they're not too on the nose, as long as they don't do that 1-to-1 ratio we discussed earlier, unless it is intentionally cheeky, they can delve into those issues a little bit more subtly.
Yeah. Star Trek, not that it's anything to do with fantasy, is a good example of that sort of writing.
Yeah.
Where aliens were just the substitution for like your
right
ethnic groups and whatnot. In what's a good fantasy example that is popular? Maybe Mortal Instruments seems popular at the moment. I don't know too much about it, but it does.
Mortal Instruments. That's one by what is the author's name? Is it? Oh goodness, because I think she's actually. Is it Cassandra Clare?
Could be.
Mortal Instruments.
Yeah, so it is.
Yes,
it's Cassandra Clare, and it's been adapted into a Netflix series. Yes, but I mean, from the Shadowhunter Chronicles, apparently. Okay.
Yeah, so this one's often considered an urban fantasy or paranormal sort of thing. And my understanding, I'm not super familiar with it. I've only read little bits and pieces of the first book because actually one of my favorite writers, Kelly Link, is writing buddies with and close friends with Cassandra Clare. And she's anthologized some of her stories, Claire's stories, in her own just collections that she draws from other writers that she likes and admires. And my interest was piqued enough to take a look into Claire's other stuff. It's not for me personally, but I got the sense that it was sort of what you were talking about earlier, almost, the fairy creatures and mythical beasts and monsters and sort of stuff in our modern era. And they're sort of hidden, but people know that they exist, but it's almost like urban legends, if that sort of makes sense.
Yeah. And those 4 or 5 subgenres, I think make up maybe 90 to 95% of all fantasy at the moment.
Say that again?
Those high fantasy, epic fantasy, low fantasy, high and low magic settings, I would say that's basically all fantasy at the moment.
Right.
And there are a few others, but I would say almost all of them have one of those elements as part of them. So if we talk about sword and sorcery or heroic fantasy or something like that, it's often either a low magic setting, if it is just the more weighted towards the sword element, like a Conan the Barbarian. But it could also just be epic fantasy at the same time. If you take some elements from historical fantasy, they often just include the low magic or portal fantasy elements in them as a way to get into that historical past. So then, it might be time travel magic, or when you're talking about English mythology, Merlin and King Arthur, that sort of fantasy just kind of creates its own subgenre in those already existing genres. That's my opinion, anyway.
Yeah. So,
Although
can you
I'd say,
provide an
sorry,
example?
yeah, well, um, I think if we're thinking of portal fantasy in general, I'd go back to the magicians.
Yeah.
So it's portal fantasy in the sense that portal fantasy is you step through a portal into a magical world, into a different world,
Right.
right?
Yep.
C.S. Lewis, Chronicles of Narnia is an example of the wardrobe there, right? So in the magicians, the instrument is a grandfather's clock, I think, initially. Same sort of premise. Magicians in the real world have the ability to access this magical realm where all magic comes from.
Right.
And the storyline basically develops into a high fantasy setting, a high magic, high fantasy setting,
Right.
where
So,
eventually it sort of starts, in New York, just street level kind of guys doing card tricks. And he's so good at them for some reason. He doesn't know why until he finds out he has magic, right? And it devolves into a story about fighting for the survival of magic against these indifferent gods who want to stop mortals having it.
right. So it's almost like Portal Fantasy can be a jumping off point or a catalyst for people who want something that feels more grounded in reality, but they still they like getting to those high fantasy places.
It's
So
the
that
genre for the writer who wants to have everything in a story,
yeah,
right? Wants to
yeah,
have the normal world, wants to have his high fantasy world, and wants to have some sort of conversation between them.
right,
Which is
yeah,
why that sort of fantasy works so well and is quite popular. You see quite a lot of that in um, not just in fantasy, but uh, things like Japanese novels.
yeah,
You have a lot of world crossing from normal mundane world into like it's very common like a game world or high magic fantasy world, something like that.
right,
Um, but yeah, it's great because people understand it intuitively, and you don't have to explain a lot.
right. Yeah, no, that is a big trope in I was gonna say anime and just Japanese media in general. I mean, even going as far back as I mean, maybe it comes from their fairy tales, their myths and legends. I've been reading a collection of they call it ghost stories, but it's more than that by Lafcadio Hearn, who's kind of an interesting figure in fabulism and fairy tale documenters. But just getting to the point, a lot of the myths and fairy tales they are set in say feudal Japan, and there's no magic in the world, or at least not that anyone can see, but they'll encounter some sort of sprite or demon or something like that that transports them to essentially their version of fairy.
Yeah,
um, and
the
so
sort of famous fisherman's one rescues a turtle
yep,
and gets
that's
gets
the one I'm
sent
thinking
to
of.
gets sent to an underwater palace, meets queen princess, I can't remember, and they
Yes,
spend hundreds of years just sort of in like a fairy state really, and he goes
yes,
back to the world and no one knows who he is, things have changed.
right.
uh, yeah, yeah,
No,
that's
that's the exact one, and there's almost like a Pandora's box element in it as well.
yes, yeah,
Um,
so he won't age so long as he doesn't open the box, but he needs to find out what's in the box.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, I mean, I feel bad about spoiling that, I suppose, but it's hundreds of years old. So, but let's go through a few other subgenres. and to see if you think any of them stand out as exceptional. I mean,
Yeah.
Historical fantasy, we've gone through. I mean, very much. To me, it feels very much the same as medieval fantasy, except you choose your time period.
Right.
Comic fantasy, not really super familiar with that, to be honest.
You said comic?
Comic fantasy, yeah.
Hmm.
So I suppose that would include just general humorous fantasy settings. I mean, so Discworld, set on
Yeah.
the back of a giant turtle and the back of 4 elephants riding through space. Funny things happen. Makes fun of all the fantasy tropes. I guess that's where that comes from. Science fantasy, like a Star Wars.
Yes.
Um,
Fantasy is a genre that I've realized only recently that that's kind of where I hang out. I wasn't aware of that until I really started digging into fantasy and understanding it. And I realized that a lot of it does come from my exposure to fantasy, not primarily through books, but primarily through, up until recently, that is, through video games, and Japanese video games in particular. I'm thinking of the Final Fantasy series and Legend of Zelda, and within more popular media would be Star Wars. But I would define it as it is a wholly unique fantasy world where there is also really cool, high tech.
John Carter of Mars, I think I would suggest
Yeah.
for people to check out. Maybe check out the comic books rather than the novels.
Right. Yes.
Depending on whether you can handle the time period sort of setting, I guess.
Sure.
It hasn't aged particularly well. Let me say that.
Yeah.
So I think what I'm about to say is a little bit controversial, but the more I watch Star Trek, the more I'm convinced it is just science fantasy rather than science fiction.
Oh no, that's
I would have argued very strongly previously that it was science fiction based on scientific facts, but maybe I was just young when I watched it the first time, and now when you watch it, none of these things make particular sense. There's very little of the technobabble that actually stands up to any sort of science scrutiny. I mean, the warp drive in particular is just magic.
Yeah.
Beaming people from the surface of planets and that sort of nonsense.
Well,
it does like sort of advocate for science all the time, but I don't think it contains much science really. It's just a means to a story.
Right, and I think you're exactly right there. So for me, there's 2 types of science fantasy. There is fantasy masquerading as science fiction, which is what I would call Star Trek, and then science fiction masquerading as wait a minute, did I get that back?
Yes, fantasy and then masquerading as science fiction. Yeah. That's the Star Wars side of it, I guess.
Yeah, and then the reverse of that. And so, for instance, science fiction masquerading as fantasy might be the Dragon Rider series by Anne McCaffrey. So, it's essentially a story where functionally the science is actually magic, or it's 100% magic, but even the technology functions as in almost a magical way. I don't know if I said that clearly. I'm trying to think of another example.
So Stargate might be a good example of something that sort of starts out as maybe science fiction with a sort of medieval kind of fantasy bend to it.
Right.
And then over time sort of develops into a fantasy setting, which I quite like. It's a very enjoyable show. But gradually as the story progresses, you start off with, okay, we just have to accept that wormholes can be generated. Wormholes are a real thing. I guess people can go through them in Stargate. But then, you get magical ascended beings who are like gods and resurrecting people from the dead, and eventually it's just this is a fantasy story that
Right.
is just happens to involve the American Air Force.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So a good actually the Star Trek whomever the powers that be at that create Star Trek have become painfully aware of the fact that their earliest shows were science fantasy, and so much so that they have actually started hiring scientists as consultants to make sure that their current products that they're coming out with are as scientifically accurate as they can be. There's a really
I think they're not doing a particularly good job if that is that is true. I'm not sure you can make a starship powered by mushrooms, but let's
right
skip over that.
But they do have on staff like
yeah, the scientific consultants, I suppose,
right,
which is a good thing for them to do.
I mean, Marvel has that as well for their MCU, which I would also say is science fantasy. Essentially, for me anyway, the line between them, if it is something where the technology is plausible and possible, but it's just pushed a little beyond our current limits, that's science fiction. If it is something that is outside of the realm of reality or possibility, maybe it has a science fiction aesthetic, but functionally it is fantasy.
Another genre that might be a little bit outside of the normal would be the paranormal.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if it is necessarily part of the fantasy genre. It's one of the ones I'm uneasy about calling fantasy, because often it's just a way of delivering maybe a horror story would be the classic paranormal trope.
Right. Well, it's a very weird. It's like an update of the Gothic, essentially. It's like the Gothic had a weird.
Yeah, Gothic dark fantasy sort of setting. Yes, yeah.
Yeah, mixed with
what's the famous show at the moment? Black Mirror.
Black Mirror.
I think.
Well, I mean, I do know Black Mirror. Are you saying that's potentially a paranormal?
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly some of them are. Some of them.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't necessarily put all of that in fantasy, or any of that in fantasy at all.
Right.
Although, when you start to include elements like ghosts and angels and vampires and that sort of paranormal activity,
yeah,
then you edge closer towards fantasy.
Yeah.
A show like Supernatural would be a paranormal show.
Yes.
A Christian sort of paranormal fantasy show, I guess. All right, similar to Constantine or something like that. Where angels and demons are real, and these people exist, to keep the world safe from those sort of things.
Right.
I think that has all the elements of a high fantasy, but I think it's removed in the tone so much from fantasy in general that I'm not entirely sure it belongs in the genre.
So, what is it that for you distinguishes it, paranormal from fantasy, that makes it feel like it shouldn't be, like, regardless of whatever supernatural or fantastical or magical elements it may contain? Is it the fact that it focuses more on a horror tone, or that it primarily the monsters and creatures and things of that nature that it does have inhabiting it tend to be from specific religious folklore?
I mean, I think fundamentally, maybe mechanically, that's true, right? I associate fantasy with arcane magic generated, like by reciting spells and doing rituals and things like that. And the paranormal would be, religious type magic, I guess.
Okay.
like The Exorcist, for example, performing religious ceremonies to get your magical result,
Gotcha.
which, depending on what you believe, may or may not be, quote unquote magic, I suppose.
Sure. Oh man, I just spent like the last 2 years reading or making a study of magic as it's been perceived in the real world, and it was a whole book of grimoires and commentaries on it, and just this massive tome. So I have a lot of ideas on what you're discussing here, but I don't know if it's something that we could. It would have to be its own episode, but I have it. I would say that there's a little bit more nuance to it than what you're kind of presenting it as, but
Really,
I totally understand how. Yeah.
But just to go through the rest of the things I think might not be part of fantasy, I'd say other forms of speculative fiction, even though they all have a sort of fantasized element in them, might be completely realistic. I mean, it might just
Sure.
be a imagined scientific future.
Sure.
The Expanse could be something like that, where it's not necessarily anything to do with magic.
Right.
Even though it doesn't necessarily make much scientific sense either. Horror or gothic, not fantasy, fiction, doesn't necessarily have to be fantastical. Fairy tales and fairy stories, I mean, that could just be lumped in with other religious writings.
Sure.
Some of them are just, like jinns from Arabic sort of history. They're just, as far as some people are concerned, a historical monster.
Right. Well, I think the reason I would say that they are sort of the forerunners to fantasy. It's what laid the foundation, because most of the world's stories are fantastical, meaning the literary traditions from as long as we had the written word up until pretty much around the 17th century, most literature had supernatural or fantastical elements in it, and it had these mythological creatures or fairy creatures. It wasn't until the Enlightenment that we had this obsession with realism, essentially, in fiction, and we had an immediate kickback with the Romantic era, but then in the last 200 years, at least within academia, we've had this really hard push for life as lived in truly great literature. But I would say that fantasy proper, as we understand it today, did not start until the 1930s as a genre, a recognizable genre. But I would say that it is built on the back of the world literary tradition of myths and legends and folklore and fairy tales, because all the monsters and all the magic is in some form or fashion a mixing or dilution of those elements from traditional literature, if that makes sense. So I would say it's almost...
I agree completely with that. And I just... One last one that I want to include before we talk on magical realism.
Yes.
Which is something like Pan's Labyrinth, where you're not sure if what's happening is actually happening. There's a sort of element of an unreliable narrator going on. You're not sure if this girl is just imagining these monsters and the magical occurrences.
Right.
And what's being presented is the real world, with a sort of tint of magic over it.
Right.
So it may or may not be magic. It may just be completely explainable, but from this person's perspective, something magical is occurring.
Right. So I would add just a few other layers to that. So the way that I've understood magical realism is it's essentially actual magic, truly magical things, whether it's creatures or unexplainable events coming into our contemporary reality. So one of the most famous examples of a magic realist story is A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And it's essentially a old man with massive, what appear to be angel wings, crashes onto a beach of a small middle American town. And people think he's an angel at first, but he doesn't seem to have any sort of, he doesn't seem to be in any way sacred. He's quite filthy and disgusting. And at first he's sort of this curiosity and evolves into a sort of a circus freak. But he's very much real and everybody can see him. So it's magic invading the real world in such a way that it's treated almost as mundane, if that makes sense. Whereas with what you're kind of talking about would be, I guess, what I would call more a blending of that and another genre, surrealism being the things that you're seeing that appear to be fantastical are just a product of the warped perception of the POV character, the point of view character, right? And then Pan's Labyrinth is this kind of interesting blend of those two where it is ambiguous. Is this a place, is this a world in which there are genuinely fantastical things that are invading this girl's life, or is it her fractured psychological state responding to trauma? And I think that's a really fun place to be in storytelling, a really interesting place to be anyway. But so psychological or surreal storytelling is where you're firmly convinced, okay, this is just the character's fractured psychology that is producing these seemingly fantastical things. And then magic realism is, no, these things are very real. But the thing that delineates it from fantasy is it's divorced from any sort of mythological or religious or even traditional explanation. So if Haruki Murakami is kind of like the go-to magic realist in the world tradition today. And in his stories, for instance, there's a book called The Hidden Library. Have you heard of it?
I know.
And it's the magical things that are happening in it are 100% happening to the character, but there's no logic to it. There's no rhyme or reason to it. He goes to the library, and when he gets to the library, he finds a secret passage down to the bottom of it. And there is a talking sheep. And, when he opens a book about shepherds in the, 9th century of the Middle East, he is suddenly, a shepherd along with them. So it's just this sort of, it's real, actual magical things happening in the life of the character, but without any known mechanism, but not even a knowable mechanism. Whereas in, a fantasy story, we don't know.
Another maybe a more well-known example of something I think is what you're describing is there's a Japanese movie, The Girl Who Leapt Through Time, which is a story about this girl who just, if she runs fast enough and jumps, she can kind of go back in time, right?
Yeah.
Would you she abuses it to sleep in or change the outcome of a conversation or something like that.
Right.
Would that?
So I would still call that fantasy because there's a consistency to it. From what I have read and studied of magic realism, because it's one of the few sorts of fantastical literatures that's allowed in MFA and BFA programs that you're allowed to write and study and all that sort of thing, at least in my experience. if there's a explanation behind how the fantastical thing works, if it is repeatable, it's fantasy. So in that case, the girl, she knows how to travel through time. In a fantasy, in a magic realism version of that story, that would probably only happen one time. She would run fast enough and she would leap through time, but from there on, that wouldn't work again. There would be other fantastical things that would continue to happen. You can see a lot of this in sort of French New Wave films from the 1960s, where, you know, there's one famous one, I think it's called Meshes of the Afternoon, where these two characters are walking down a highway and they suddenly, just out of nowhere, one of the Bronte sisters is walking down the highway with them, and this is set in like the 1960s or so, and they just walk up to her and set her on fire and keep going. It's a completely unprovoked, fantastical event. Nothing like it happens before or after, and there's no explanation for it.
So a description I found on the masterclass website was magical realism, similar to low fantasy. Magical realism characters accept fantastical elements like levitation and telekinesis as part of their otherwise realistic world, as in Gabriel Garcia Marquez's classic 100 Years of Solitude.
Right. Exactly.
And I think that is fair enough as a description. But I think possibly it's broad and undefined because, you know, that's where it lives, in this kind of weird, surreal part of fantasy.
Right. That's honestly a good description for it, is surrealist fantasy. Yeah.
Okay. I think that's all of the. Oh, actually, I suppose superhero fiction is one last element of fantasy fiction.
You said what now?
Superhero fiction, like.
Oh yeah.
Everyone, I'm sure, is familiar with that, and it contains any element from any of the things we've talked about.
Right.
It could be literally any. It doesn't even necessarily have to be anything to do with fantasy, really.
Right.
Which is why I'd say, well, superhero fiction is always a fantasy.
Yeah. Not all fantasy is superhero fiction.
Correct. And it should rather be taken as its own genre, specifically when you're referring to the two main ones, like Marvel and DC. Yeah. They are their own worlds, with vaguely defined rules, which are very important to the readership, I suppose.
Yes. So I have a theory, and I'm not the first one to say this, that essentially superhero fiction is, so, you know, we were talking about how I think that fantasy proper, which started in the 1930s and 40s, was built on the backs of the world literature leading up to that, the fantastical world literature, which is 90% of the world's literature.
Yeah, taking your classic stories and then building a fantasy universe off them.
Right, exactly. I would say that we're kind of, with superhero fiction, it's almost like the clock is starting back, or we're in a new era of myth making.
So Percy Jackson would be based on the Greek mythology, right?
Right. Exactly.
Whereas Superman is his own
myth,
own Zeus.
Exactly.
It's starting again from scratch. Yeah.
And some people have said that it is America's mythology, because America doesn't really have. I mean, we have our own little folk tales and stuff like that, but we didn't have a mythology the way that a lot of the other world's cultures did. I would say that was true, at least in the start of superhero fiction, but I think it has become the world's mythology. I think it has become a new world mythology.
No, that's certainly true, especially I mean, you go anywhere in the world and say Spider-Man, and it's impossible to find a person who hasn't heard
Right.
that name.
And I mean, there are creators, whether they're dealing with an American company like DC or Marvel, they may be from, you know, other cultures, other countries, who are creators creating superheroes reflective of those cultures and identities. But there are also, you know, many, I mean, other comic superhero creators around the world who are creating their own mythologies, I guess.
I guess I'd recommend French comic writers if you want to really delve into an alternative comic book genre. They don't have the same tone as the sort of English American tradition. They're not always about you know, doing the right thing or heroes that save the day or anything like that. You often have a darker story or something like that. I give that a go if comic book fiction is something you're interested in. And then, of course, you've got Japanese manga, which is super popular right now and probably has been for a very long time.
Yeah.
And that tells stories at a different pace to comic books.
Yeah.
There's much more detail, and at the same time, I'd say it's much slower than a comic book.
Yes. Right.
You might have the same content in a 20-page comic as you would in a 4 or 5 issue manga.
Right.
And that just comes down to the author sort of believing you need to get to know these characters before I do anything with them.
Yeah, and we discussed that a little bit. I mean, that's in a previous episode, I think, about Kisho Tenketsu, whereas, you know, in East Asian storytelling, it's not, you know, introduce characters, introduce conflict, characters try to resolve the conflict. It's, here are our characters, here's what their lives look like. Oh, third act finally is where we introduce some sort of conflict and then a response to that. So it's actually, the pacing is much different at the global level, but it's also, there's a great book called Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud, and he contrasts and compares, I mean, one issue of a manga could be 200 pages. One issue of an American comic is about 16 to 22 pages. Or 150 to 200 pages.
And just the way stories are compiled. For example, Superman is not always the same Superman, right?
Right.
Different authors get to play with that character.
Right.
And have their say and remake him. And there's only one example I can think of, like in anime / manga, which is Goku from Dragon Ball Z. And he was sort of handed over to a different author to sort of give a different
take on him.
But still, he was supervised by the original creator.
Yeah.
And so he has a remarkably consistent, you know, storyline throughout.
Right.
Whereas you get all these different stories about Superman, one where he's, you know, he gets sent to communist Russia instead of Kansas, wherever he's from. And so you get very different Supermans in a relatively short amount of time. 1 year to the next, you might get a completely different type of superhero out of American comics. Whereas your Goku example, and you've had the same character in different comics for 40 years or so.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And he's pretty consistent. And he's only been handed off, like you said, once, and I think that was in 2015 that they started with a new show with new writers. But as you said, the original creator, Akira Toriyama, is still working as a consultant, even if he's not directly involved in the storytelling. He still has some say in how those characters grow and develop.
Yeah. And it's not to say one system is better than the other. They're just, you might prefer one to the other, obviously.
Right.
I think if you prefer consistency, probably manga is
Yeah.
for you. Yeah. Anyway,
Yeah, consistency and depth.
and depth, certainly. If you want to delve into a character's psyche over the course of 40 years, you can read all of the Dragon Ball manga. Obviously, it's not about that. It's about, kung fu fighting, really.
Right.
Which sort of evolves into space kung fu fighting at some point. But I've heard interesting arguments about how, Akira Toriyama, the original author, wanted to show the sort of mental deficiency of a person who's obsessed with fighting. So the main character always just wants to fight a stronger hero, a stronger villain. Doesn't care about saving the world, doesn't care about even at the expense of his family sometimes. He doesn't think about what he's doing. He just wants to fight that stronger person and get stronger himself.
No, it's so funny because, recently it seems like people have finally come to terms with the fact that, even if you love Goku as a character, there's essentially a meme now that, Goku is the world's worst father and husband, whereas Piccolo, who, is a former enemy and turned ally, is essentially the surrogate father and husband to his family while he's off gallivanting about. It's kind of hilarious.
Anyway, I do recommend it if you're interested in that sort of superhero fiction. I think that's everything I wanted to talk about today, Oliver. Is there anything else you wanted to say?
No, I mean, I think this just goes to show just how difficult it is to define fantasy. I mean, it is, and it's constantly changing, and I think that's as it should be. But I'm curious to see kind of where we head next. You were talking about how portal fantasy has become very big recently. Paranormal fantasy has been big for a while. I feel like it's either just about to break into the mainstream or maybe it's on its way out. But I'm curious, do you have any speculations before we sign off about where we're going next?
I read an article a few years ago about portal fantasy becoming the next big thing, and I think I was wrong about that.
Yeah,
it does. It happened in East Asia. That's the main form of young adult fiction there at the moment.
Right.
It didn't happen in the West, and maybe it will, but I think that suspension of disbelief isn't in the mainstream.
Right.
I think detective fiction is where the mainstream Western audience's mindset is.
Okay.
And I just think it's maybe a bridge too far for a lot of people to accept that as the new major fiction. I
think you might be right. It's fascinating to speculate on, but maybe another time.
Yes, and on that, I'd like to remind everyone, Oliver wrote the Fantasy Workbook, where he explains all sorts of things like these and how to write good fantasy. And thank you for being here, Oliver.
Yeah, thank you.
You can find me, Christopher Dean, at writerswrite.co.za or on Twitter at christopher.luke.dean. And you can find Oliver at writerswrite.co.za as well for his many fantastic articles. Thanks, everyone, for listening to this episode. Bye, Oliver.